I first noticed it in the language, not in the images. A buried mass under Arctic ice had been mapped, measured, and reduced to a phrase so empty it almost disappeared. Unusual subglacial density. That was the safe beginning. But the scans did not remain safely geological. They showed edges where stone should have blurred, repeated bands where pressure should have broken, and channels running through the interior like the memory of movement. No one called it a trunk, not officially. The word would have made the scale impossible to ignore, wider than any mountain on Earth, beneath ancient ice. The first public trace of it did not look like a discovery. It did not arrive with a press conference, a reconstruction, or the language institutions use when they want the public to understand that something extraordinary has been found. It appeared inside ordinary survey work as a mapped irregularity beneath Arctic ice, described in terms that seemed designed to end curiosity before curiosity could begin. A subglacial mass of unusual density. That was almost all the phrase permitted. The first explanation was geological, because geology is the category large enough to absorb nearly anything without embarrassment. A buried ridge, a volcanic extrusion, a mineralized column caught between older bedrock and the weight of the ice sheet. A pressure artifact distorted by snow, sediment, frozen meltwater, and radar return. Each possibility was reasonable in isolation. None required a new history of the Earth. None required anyone to imagine that life, not stone, might once have occupied that scale. This is how categories protect themselves. They do not need to deny the anomaly. They only need to name it in a way that makes the dangerous interpretation sound premature. From a distance, the geological explanation held. The Arctic is not a blank white plain. Beneath it are drowned margins, buried riverbeds, ancient basins, folded rock, and landscapes older than the ice sealing them now. If a survey finds something vast under that surface, the disciplined response is to place it first among formations. That is not deception. It is method. But method becomes something else when it refuses to notice the pattern that keeps returning. The first difficulty was the boundary. The mass did not fade into the surrounding material the way a fractured ridge should have. Its edge held too clearly in the models, not perfectly, not photographically, but with enough consistency that it had to be marked. The density changed at the perimeter with an abruptness the reports did not dramatize. They called it an interface, a neutral word, a useful word, a word that could mean stone against sediment, ice against mineral, or something once exteriorized before the world around it hardened. No one called it skin. No one called it bark. That silence should not be exaggerated. One cannot make a fossil out of a vocabulary gap. Radar is not sight. It gives delays, shadows, and modeled probabilities. Ice can enlarge what it bends. Mineral veins can imitate order. Sediment can produce persuasive bands. I want to be precise about that because the weakest version of this story would decide too quickly. But the resemblance did not appear once. It appeared again. Inside the mass, the imaging suggested repeated variation moving outward from a central region. Not clean circles, not textbook rings, nothing so convenient. The bands were broken, interrupted, mineral heavy in places, partially erased in others, the way any ancient structure would be after burial, pressure, freezing, thawing, and replacement over time. Still they repeated. Still they organized themselves around a center. Still they behaved less like accidental fracture than recorded growth. The reports did not say growth. They said radial density patterning. That phrase matters because it stands at the edge of two worlds. On one side is geology, where bands, layers, and pressure structures can restore order. On the other side is biology, where rings are not decoration, but time made visible. The phrase does not cross that line. It walks along it, carefully, as though aware of what would happen if the next word were spoken. Then there were the channels. They ran through parts of the interior in long, vertical paths, irregular but persistent, neither clean enough to be engineered cavities, nor chaotic enough to vanish into ordinary cracking. They suggested movement without declaring what moved. Water after burial, mineral flow, pressure release. Or if the biological interpretation were allowed briefly into the room, the fossilized remainder of a system that once carried material through a living body of impossible size. Again, the safer language arrived first. The scale made everything worse. Fossil wood exists. Petrified forests exist. What is forbidden is magnitude. The model diameter did not belong to known trees, ancient or living. It exceeded the preserved trunks used as the upper boundary of public imagination. At that point, the explanation had to retreat into stone. Because if the Arctic mass was even partly biological, then it was not merely an unusual fossil. It was evidence that the permitted size of life had been set too low after the fact. And that possibility did not enter the public record as a question. Beneath the sealed Arctic ice, the later imaging did not settle the matter. It made settlement harder. That is where official summaries become most careful. Not when evidence is absent, but when evidence is present in a form that cannot be comfortably admitted into the wrong category. A blurred scan can be ignored. A single resemblance can be called coincidence. Several resemblances inside one structure require clear refutation, or vocabulary, disciplined enough to prevent the question from forming. The Arctic mass received the vocabulary. The outer surface, where the density shifted most sharply, was described as irregular exterior texturing. The phrase was technically defensible. It committed to nothing. It did not say bark because bark would have carried the reader too quickly into biology. It did not say shell because shell implied too much. It said texturing, a word broad enough to make almost any surface harmless. But the texture did not distribute itself like simple fracture. It gathered in plates, ridges, torn seams, and long scars. It looked in the models less like rock broken by pressure than a surface once layered for protection, then hardened, cracked, and replaced by mineral. That does not prove wood. It does not have to. What it shows is that the safer explanation requires more work than the language admits. Inside, the rings remained the central problem. They were not perfect. That should be emphasized. Perfect rings would almost be less believable, because no buried thing under Arctic ice should survive as a diagram. These were partial, warped, interrupted by mineral intrusion, compressed in places, widened in others, with zones where the pattern faded and returned beyond interference. But the organization was still there. A central region, outward variation, repeated density changes that behaved like intervals laid down over time. Stone can band. That is true. Sediments settle. Lava cools. Metamorphic pressure produces layering that can look astonishingly ordered. The issue is not whether geology can produce bands. The issue is whether geology explains the full combination without leaving anything behind. The exterior boundary, the radial intervals, the vertical channels, the branching structures below. Taken separately, each feature can be returned to stone. Taken together, they begin to resemble a sentence the report refuses to write. The lower extensions were the most quietly disturbing. Around the base of the mapped mass, thick forms moved outward into older sediment, dividing, narrowing, disappearing into noise, then reappearing farther away. The official description treated them as subsurface continuations. Continuations can be geological. Continuations do not demand living origin. Continuations can pass through review. Roots cannot. This is where the Arctic becomes more than a location. It becomes a witness. The idea of an ancient warm polar world is not outside accepted science. Fossil forests have been found in high northern latitudes before. Preserved stumps, leaves, cones, soils, and woody remains from periods when the region held rivers, wetlands, and seasonal light. Official history can accommodate that. It can imagine forests in the Arctic, as long as the forests remain the right size. The right size is the hidden rule. A warm Arctic is acceptable because it modifies climate. A forested Arctic is acceptable because it modifies landscape. But a trunk wider than a mountain would modify the scale of life itself. It would force questions that do not remain inside botany. Air pressure, atmospheric density, electrical conditions, soil chemistry, mineral circulation, the physics of water rising through living tissue. The structural limits we assume are natural because we have only measured the reduced world available to us now. At that scale, biology stops being scenery. It becomes architecture. That may be why the old stories begin to feel less easy to dismiss, though they should still be handled carefully. World trees appear across cultures as axes between realms, trunks that hold regions of existence apart, roots descending below, branches touching the upper world. The modern explanation is symbolism, and symbolism may be correct. But symbolism can also be what remains after scale has been lost and memory has learned to survive as myth. I'm not saying the Arctic mass proves those stories literal. What it suggests is narrower and more dangerous. Traditions may have preserved the emotional outline of forms the later world no longer allowed itself to imagine materially. Not measurements, not diagrams, shock, scale. The technical record does not enter that territory. It remains with interfaces, patterning, discontinuities, and continuations. It measures the resemblance while refusing the implication. It preserves the data while reducing the question. No debate is required, only smaller words, repeated long enough. That is how absence begins to sound almost normal. By the final stage of the record, the object begins to disappear behind the response to it. Not because the object becomes less important, but because the reaction can reveal the system more clearly than the discovery alone. A buried mass under Arctic ice, bearing resemblances to fossilized wood, should have produced a visible argument, not agreement. Argument. That is what real uncertainty leaves behind. Comparative papers, rival models, geological rebuttals, paleobotanical objections, demonstrations showing why the resemblance fails. Even ridicule would have been a trace of engagement. What appears instead is narrowing. The terms narrow, the audience narrows. The implication is kept inside language, so technical that no one outside the circle is invited to understand what is excluded. This does not prove concealment. I want to be precise. Absence is not a file with a signature at the bottom. Silence is not automatically suppression. But when a question disturbs several disciplines, and the record grows smaller rather than larger, the silence becomes part of the material. It has a shape, and that shape points back to the forbidden issue, not simply whether the Arctic mass is a fossilized trunk, but what kind of world would have been necessary for such a trunk to grow. The answer cannot be contained inside botany. It would require atmosphere, pressure, water movement, mineral availability, and conditions of growth that modern trees no longer approach. The tallest living forests already stand near the limit of what the current world can support. Their height is a negotiation with gravity, evaporation, pressure, and the difficulty of lifting water. So if something once exceeded that scale, either the object is not biological, or the world that produced it operated under conditions we have not considered seriously. That should have been the center of the inquiry. Instead, the center is avoided. If the mass is stone, the answer should be simple. Show the banding. Explain the channels. Map the lower extensions. Name the resemblance directly, then show why it fails. A good refutation approaches the strongest opposing interpretation, dismantles it, and leaves the method visible. That is not the trail we are given. We are given interfaces, patterning, discontinuities, subsurface continuations. A structure large enough to force new questions is broken into smaller phrases. The possibility is not defeated. It is dissolved. This is how the permitted scale of the past maintains itself. Not by proving every challenge wrong, but by making certain challenges sound unserious before they can be examined at full size. The Arctic, however, remains indifferent to that language. It does not care whether a committee prefers formation to trunk, interface to bark, continuation to root. Ice preserves without needing consensus. It covers. It compresses. It delays. It seals older ground beneath a surface modern culture mistakes for emptiness. That may be the most unsettling part. The object has not vanished. It has not been burned, quarried, moved, or reduced to a legend that can be argued away as metaphor. If the readings are accurate, it is still there, beneath the polar surface, too immense to erase physically, and too inconvenient to name plainly. Sometimes the perfect archive is a frozen continent. I'm not claiming that every mountain was once alive. I'm not claiming that every mesa is a stump, or that every old myth is a technical record. The evidence does not support that. What this discovery suggests is more precise. It suggests that the modern scale of life may not be the scale by which older life should be judged. That is a different kind of danger, because if our categories were built after diminishment, then anything belonging to an earlier scale would enter the present as an error. It would be seen, measured, and translated into geology. Not because the translation is proven, but because no other category remains respectable enough to receive it. The first scan saw a shadow under the ice. The reports gave it smaller names. The models returned ringed edges, rings, channels, extensions. The language held. The question did not disappear, but it was made difficult to ask in public without sounding as though one had already left the serious world. And perhaps that is the function of the silence. The trunk, if that is what it is, waits beneath the Arctic with no need to persuade anyone. Wider than the mountains used to explain it. Older than the ice that hides it. Present in the data, absent from the conversation, and preserved in the one archive that has never learned to reduce its contents for comfort. Not proven, not refuted. There.